Let me start with, we all know that inequality has increased a lot. There has been a lot of work, in particular recent work by people like Thomas Piketty, who actually used to be my students many years ago, Emmanuel Saez and others. What they are doing is essentially concentrating on the top 1% or the top 0.1%. And they have a story there which is essentially about financial capital. The main argument, if you remember the big book, this huge book by Thomas, is something like the rate of interest is higher than the rate of growth, which means that if you just put your money at the current rate and sit on it, your wealth will grow faster than wealth. Well, we can discuss the relevance of this. It might work for some countries. I don't think it works for the US, even at the top 1%. But what I want to talk about is what I would call the other 99%, because there has been a huge increase in inequality. And in particular, the phenomenon that I want to talk about is not so much very wealthy people becoming even wealthier. I'm going to talk about the people at the bottom or even in the middle of the distribution who used to do well, to do decently, and that's no longer the case. It's important from an economic point of view. I think it's very important from a political point of view. We have seen a lot of tremendous changes in the US, in the UK, now in Europe, and so on. And I think it's hard to understand those kind of waves, political waves, if we don't understand the economics behind. And I think inequality plays a huge role. So there is a large increase in inequality. I will give you some data on this. It's really striking. It's probably even worse than what you thought. And in particular, as I said, if you take people at the bottom of the distribution, there has been at best a stagnation, if not a decline. And I'm not talking about the last 2-3 years. I'm talking about 30-40 years. There are many causes. Technical progress, obviously. I think that's the main culprit. And by the way, this will be linked to what I'm going to say. International trade, maybe, I don't think it's very important, but there is something of it. Decline of union and so on and so forth. The one thing I want to concentrate on, and that's really the topic of my talk, is human capital. Now, what do we, economists, call human capital? Well, it's a set, it's not only education, it's the set of skills, of knowledge, know-how, ability that have a value on the market. Now, this dates back to someone who was a friend of mine, but also a great inspiration, Gary Becker, back in the 50s, 60s, was one of the first with people at the University of Chicago to recognize that education is an investment, that we're spending, when you spend time and money acquiring an education as opposed to entering the labor market, you're giving up some current resources, but you're increasing your future resources. And that's exactly the definition of an investment. And what you're building up is human capital, which has the same logic as physical capital, except that it's much more important. So it's human capital I'm going to talk about. And in this talk, I'm going to do two things. First of all, I give you a quick picture of inequality and its evolution over the last decade. And in this kind of overview, I will put a lot of emphasis on the role of human capital. But then I will talk, so this first point is essentially well known. This will not be, this is something that you must have read somewhere. We'll just give you some data, which I found sort of striking, but that's well known. Next, I will talk about my own research. And you know, the starting point of my research is that human capital is not given by God. Human capital is endogenous. People make decisions, so we need to understand the motivations, the incentives for those decisions. And what I will do is I will link this kind of evolution with demography, and in particular with marital patterns. So at the end, I will talk about the marriage market. Let me give you a brief idea of what my argument will be, and then I will be a bit more specific. Human capital has always been important. It's always, when your kid enter life, professional life, it's important that they start with some good education. We all know that. But it's much more important now than it used to be the case 50 years ago, by an order of magnitude. And this has consequences. The first consequence is that people invest more. And people invest more in their own human capital, but more importantly, they invest much more in the human capital of those children. I will give you data about this. This, in terms, theory predict that it should have an impact on matching patterns. And this is a less obvious prediction, but I will show you data that indicate that it's there big time. And at the end of the day, this might result in what I call an inequality spiral, which I will describe in more detail. So let me start with well-known things, the story of inequality. 5 facts. Let me start with the evolution of income since the mid-70s. Now, what you have here is should I take the mic? If I want to. So what you have here is, well, maybe I stay here, is the evolution of real family income between 1947, between 1947 and 2016, red people are the wealthy one, the top 95%. The median is in beige, and the blue is the bottom. And what you see, what's very striking, is that during those 30 years, from the mid-40 to the mid-70, everybody's growing at exactly the same pace. There is this huge growth, like we're moving from 50 to more than 100, so it more than doubles in 30 years, which is a remarkable achievement. But everybody's benefiting. So if you take as a benchmark 100 in 73, everybody follows the same path. And then you have this huge divergence, and you see that pretty much for the wealthy people, the evolution has been the same, or more or less at the same speed. Whereas at the bottom, you see more like a stagnation. Next slide is even more impressive from my perspective. This is a paper by a colleague of mine, Fatih Guvnen and co-authors. So what he does is takes people entering the labor market at the age of 25. This is the year on which those kids, well, now they're adults actually. Some of them are quite old, but so think of yourself as a young guy, 25, entering the labor market, and ask yourself, what has been the present value of the total future income that this person is going to receive during the life? So we're not looking at current income. We're looking at what economists would call the permanent income, the total income. So that's the evolution for the bottom 10%, the bottom 25%, the median, the top 25%, and the top 10%. And what you see is that if you take people entering in 65 and people entering in 85, for the people at the bottom, if anything, it has declined. Same here, same at the medium. Actually, you need to go as high as the top 25% to see just a stagnation. And at the top here, you see a huge increase. Now, what does this tell you? And by the way, this is for men. Women, we have a completely different story. I'll come to that later. But what does it tell you? Well, those are US data. Part of what's called the American dream is this kind of myth that you're going to move up. And moving up as 2-dimension, if you work hard yourself, going to be better off throughout time. But more importantly, your kids will do better than what you did. That, your kids will have a better life than you had. And that's the motivation that you see in the movies. It's really one of the founding myths of the American democracy. And we see that this has stopped being true there, except for the very top. What happens to those generations is that the parents, not only they see their own income stagnating, but they realize that their children will not do better. Actually, they might even do slightly worse than they did, despite the fact that the economy has been growing and they see people doing much better. You want to understand votes for Donald Trump, I think it's very hard to disregard this kind of data. This is the evolution of inequality. The number here at the bottom is the level of inequality. This is measured by the income at the top 10 percentile divided by the income at the bottom 10 percentile. So it's a standard measure. The US used to be very unequal, not the most unequal. The most unequal, this is the numbers are in 1980. So the most unequal was Korea. France was quite unequal. But the blue line is the evolution, and you see that not only the United States started with a high level of inequality, but this inequality increased a lot, much more than anywhere else over the period. Now, let me come to human capital. This is obvious. Human capital is a good thing on the labor market. It decreases your unemployment rate. You know, the current unemployment rate in the US is very low. It's less than 4%. But for the people with who are high school dropout, it's actually 7%. Whereas people with a PhD, it's 0. I mean, it's 1% because some people are changing jobs and they're in between, but this is complete full unemployment. Actually, if anything, we have a lack of manpower at this level of, and the same for, you will not be surprised to see that the weekly earnings are much higher if you have an education. The US, this is just telling you that the US is probably, you know, you can ask yourself, to what extent does difference in education translate into differences in income? How responsive are income to education? And this varies across country. And without entering into the details, what you see that the higher elasticity of income to education is in the US, whereas countries like Northern Europe, Italy, surprisingly, I'll come back to Italy, are at the other side of the distribution. Now, that was the role of human capital in inequality, but let me talk about the evolution of inequality, which is really what I'm interested in. So what this is what's called the college premium. You take the average wage of someone who has a college degree. Remember that in the US, college is 4 years of university, right? So you take the average wage of someone who has a college degree and you divide that by the average wage of someone who has just stopped after high school. That's an estimation of the benefits of reaching college. It's not an exact estimation, let me emphasize this point, because we have selection issues. The people who continued and went to an university are not the same as the people who did not. And you need to control for that. There are various ways. So those numbers, those are raw numbers, so they should not be taken as face value, certainly, in particular when you compare gender. I'll talk to that in a minute. But what you see is that 122 was quite small. It meant that going to college increased your wage by 22%. It's significant, it's not huge. Well, of course, it's something that you receive for the rest of your life, right? But still. Now it's 70%. So you see that the ratio has been multiplied, the increase has been multiplied by more than 3. Women, you see something like this, we move from 42% to 82%, so it doubles, it's less. Now, one of the reasons we have this asymmetry, by the way, is that those numbers are very low. And the reason why this number is very low is that, remember, that was the generation in 72, that was Vietnam War, and lots of males enrolled to college just to avoid the draft. Of course, in the usual supply and demand kind of phenomenon, if supply increases all of a sudden, you expect the return to go down, which is exactly what took place. But still, there is no doubt that the value of education on the labor market has increased a lot over the period. And note that it has, if anything, it has increased at a faster rate for men than for women. This is the same as I did before. It's trying to compute the lifetime income that you can expect when you enter the labor market. And the number is simply, back in 65, having a college degree meant a total gain over the whole life of about $200,000. Now it's more like 600. So here you see, if you accumulate over the years, we're talking about very large numbers. This is net on tuition. You might have heard that, US university are charging high tuition and this is terrible and so on. Of course, I disagree with this. Part of the reason being that the tuition is used to pay my wage, but it's not. It's certainly not the case. Investing in university training is much more profitable now than used to be the case in the past, even though the cost has increased. The cost has increased, but the benefits have increased even faster. Okay, David Arthur has the very nice story for this, which is, let's use a simple supply and demand story, which is on the production side, there is an increased demand for educated people. Why that? Essentially because of technical progress. We need less workers because we can replace them with robots, but we need engineers who can design the robots, we can repair the robots, we can design the software that will be used in the robots, and so on and so forth. Now, this graph is sort of interesting. You take all hours worked in the country, And you ask yourself what percentage of those hours are worked by people with a college degree. And back in the 60s, in the mid-60s, it was less than 20%. Now it's more than 50%. So here, this tells you that there's been a huge demand for higher education in the production system, which we see. I mean, back in the 60s, the giants were General Motors, General Electric, and so on. Now the giants are Google, Alphabet, all those places in which essentially what those firms are hiring is people with very high level of human capital. Now, what author says is that you just take this as an indicator of demand, and you sort of adjust supply as given by the number of people leaving university, and you get essentially most of the story of the evolution of the college premium. But the college premium to a large extent can be explained by just saying the labor market needed more trained people, and the supply side was able to provide, but not enough, which meant that the price went up. Last, let me talk a little bit about social mobility. Here I'm talking about intergenerational inequality. So the kind of question you're asking here is, if the parents are born at the bottom of the distribution, what's the probability that the kid will remain at the bottom of the distribution, or on the contrary, will make it to the top? Now, this is a specific measure of this, which is the income, which is on the vertical axis, which is the generational earnings in elasticity. Let me not enter into the details, but essentially, the higher you are on this graph, the less intergenerational mobility you have. Because if you're very high on this graph, it means that if you want to predict the wage of the kids, you just look at the wage of the parents, and this gives you a very good indicator. Whereas if you're below, essentially it tells you, if you know the wage of the parents, doesn't tell you much about what the wage of the kids will be, which is exactly the definition of a lot of mobility. So what you see is that there are some places in which there is a very low level of mobility, and look at where the United States are. I mean, this myth that the United States is the land of opportunity and they can make it, that's not true. That's definitely not true now, and it has not been the case for the last 20, 30, 40 years. Maybe it might have been true at the beginning of the 20th century, but now it's just something like a religion which is no longer based on any reality. At the bottom, not surprisingly, we find Northern European countries, and then you note that Italy is up there. Now, what you have here is income inequality. So what you see is that the situation in which you have the most inequality cross-sectional, in which the dispersion of income is wider, are also the countries in which you have a lot less mobility across generation. So another part of the American myth is that we have a lot of inequality now, but this is compensated by the fact that people can move up quite fast, especially from one generation to the other. What you see, this line tells you it's not the case. The country in which you have most inequality are also the country in which you will see less movements. The second graph has the same vertical axis, but the horizontal axis, I put the college premium. So the college premium, this horizontal axis tells you, this is the number I had before, which was in the case of the US, 75%. It tells you how much more are you making if you have a college degree as compared to if you just have a high school degree. So to the right of the graph, you got the countries in which human capital has a huge impact on wages. And what you see is, again, you got this straight line. The country in which you see less intergenerational mobility are precisely the country in which education matters most. What this tells you is that the story is not a story that wealthy people give financial wealth to their kids. What the wealthy people do is they give educational wealth. They give human capital to their kids. And when, in those countries in which human capital makes most difference, we see this kind of smaller mobility. The only exception is Italy here. Italy is a very strange case, because Italy, you don't have much mobility, but it doesn't seem to be due to human capital. Human capital is less important in Italy than in other countries. Why that? I'm not a specialist of Italy. There are specialists of Italy in this room, so I'm not going to talk about, but I find it's fun. Okay, that's just presentation of things that we know. Let me now briefly talk about my own research, and in particular, the demographics of this. So let me go back to this demand-supply story. Essentially, on the productive side, there is a huge demand for human capital. What about, and this is due to a bunch of things, technical progress and so on. What about supply? Why is it that the educational system has not been able to provide the kind of trained people that were needed? Now, one thing you realize, which is very surprising, I'm talking about the US here, but it's true in many countries also, maybe not to the same extent, is that the demand for higher education is extremely gender specific. And that's quite interesting. Now, the first graph here, let me tell you how to read it. Right-hand side, wealthy country, left-hand side, poor country. Definition of wealthy and poor, per capita GDP above or below the median. Standard definition. Decades, 70s, 80s, 90s, until 2010 on both sides. The size of the bar is the proportion of the population with a college degree. The dark blue is male, and the light blue is female. So the story, what you see in wealthy countries now, women are more educated than men. If you do that country by country, it's remarkable. It's true in basically all countries. It's a huge change. Here, the proportion was slightly above 50%. Now it's 110, sometimes 120. That's the kind of change that people don't see, but I think it's much more important in the long run than even the crisis of 2008 and so on and so on. This is something that is there for good and for a long time. And even in developing countries, we're not yet there, but you see the trend. Okay, this is about the US. Let me tell you a few things about this graph. You take any given year between 1968 and 2008, you take the population aged 30 to 40. So people, you're sure they have completed their training. And you ask yourself what percentage of the population has some college, so at least 2 years of university, college degree, that the dashed line, that's 4 years of university, and this is college plus. This is 5 years and above. Red, women are in red and men are in blue. So for the first message is women are more educated than men at all degrees. And the overtaking took place in the early 2000s for the highest level. What's even more surprising is if you concentrate on this red rectangle here, this is exactly the period during which the college premium, and especially the college plus premium, exploded. This is a period between this moment here and this moment there. The financial benefit of having a degree of that level more than doubled. So we're economists, we believe in incentives. If the return on an investment doubles, you would expect people to invest much more. And you see that for women, big time, huge time. The proportion here is less than 4%, here it's 11%. The proportion has been multiplied by essentially 3 over a very short period of 30 years. But what's even more remarkable is that for men, we don't see anything. If anything, we have a decline. Now, this is a puzzle, right? How come men and women faced with exactly the same incentives respond in completely different ways? Our claim is you cannot understand this kind of phenomenon if you don't look at more deeper demographic effects, and in particular what's going on the marriage market. Now, we have a bunch of papers in which we try to explain that, but let me come to a very simple idea. Why is it that people invest in human capital, in education? Standard response, you get reward on the labor market. And that's true, we've seen that. The problem is the reward is the same, and the evolution of the reward is the same for men and for women. If anything, as we saw before, the college premium increased at a faster pace for men than for women. So you can explain certainly the increase in education by women, but it's very hard to explain why we didn't see the same for men. Actually, if you just look at the labor market, you don't see any difference between genders. But it's not the only thing. There are additional benefits which are perceived on the marriage market. And you know, this is sort of very naive, but it's true. depending on your level of education, the probability of getting married is not the same. The person you're going to marry is not the same, definitely. And you look at 19th century novels, you see plenty of stories of women acquiring an education and obviously coming from upper middle class. And obviously they have no intention whatsoever to ever enter the labor market. They could not, they would not have been able to. The main reason why they acquire this kind of education is the marriage market, is the kind of husband that they could attract. Now, I'm claiming that the same logic is present here, except that we don't have this kind of complete asymmetry that the male is the breadwinner and the woman will stay at home. Actually, essentially, we're moving toward a symmetry between genders, but this has very important consequences. So the arguments that we make in this paper is that the kind of benefits that you get on the marriage market, so over and above whatever you get on the labor market, an additional reason for investing in human capital is your kind of marital prospects. I will spare you the technology, the equations. These are things that you cannot directly measure, so you need to try some kind of models. But let me just give you a kind of broad idea of what the model looks like in plain English. What are the kind of things that we want to capture using our equations? If you're an economist and you think about marriage, there are two components. The first thing is, what is marriage? And the basic notion is something like there is an economic gain. Well, there are things that we economists do not model. There is love, there is companionship, there is whatever, taste, affinity, things like this. But there are economic gains, there is no doubt. It's not just by chance that wealthy people marry wealthy people and educated people marry educated people. So there are gains, what we call a surplus, which are shared between the spouses. So what's the nature of those surplus? What is it that you can do much better, in a much more efficient way when you're married than when you're single, each on your side? And the obvious one is fertility and investment in children. Everything we know about children's education is that both parents' time is very important, and more importantly, that the education of the parents is a crucial factor in the development of the kids. So if you're in a world in which it's more important, actually much more important than in the past, to put your child on tracks in life by giving this kid a high level of education, then you would expect that it's much more important now to marry, if you're educated, to marry a spouse who's educated. And by the way, it also implies that it's much more important to invest into your children. Well, you work out the model, and that's exactly what the model takes you. Essentially, the traditional theory of marriage, Becker 60, essentially it was a theory about specialization. Women stay at home because there are chores to be done, and we need someone to clean the dishes and so on and so forth. And specialization is efficient. And I think it made sense at that time, although with this story, it's sort of very hard to reconcile this story with assortative matching, with the fact that even then, educated people tended to marry educated people. But definitely now, this is not the kind of story we believe anymore. We don't see that. I will give you numbers that are quite clear. But on the other hand, the most important aspect is now human capital production. And what I mean is investment in human capital of your children. The crucial thing is that when you talk about the technology of human capital production, first of all, the parents' own human capital is a crucial input, and the parental inputs are complement, not substitute. That complement, not substitute, it means essentially that it's always good to invest into your kid, but it's even more profitable in terms of outcome if your spouse does the same. You put all this in a model. I will, as I said, spare the details and everything, but these are the prediction of the model. So we did this exercise. We worked out the model, and these are the predictions of the model. First of all, we should expect that people globally spend less time on chores, especially women. Actually, men, according to our model, we should see that men spend a bit more time washing the dishes and cleaning up the house, just because there are many couples in which the wife is more educated than the husband, and then there is absolutely no economic reason for the wife to spend more time doing cleaning the dishes. That's what. So that's something that we can test directly on the data. We should expect more time to be spent on children, especially by the father, and especially by the most educated people. Now, this is completely counterintuitive, because the most educated people, they have a very high wage. They are the people for which the cost of spending time with their kids instead of working overtime is the highest. But the model predicts that despite this fact, they should be more willing to spend time with their kid, not spend time for leisure. I mean, part of it is leisure. In a sense, it's always a pleasure, but in terms of investing. So in particular, what we should see is an increase in the time spent in development-related kind of activities with the kids. Now let me give you some data and then I will conclude. Time use, USA, Canada, UK, 75, 2003. Let me concentrate on USA, the picture is the same for the other two. That's the time spent cleaning the dishes. And what you see is that it has decreased a lot for women, but it has slightly increased for men. That's exactly what you would expect. I'm not sure how many people, if I was asking to this audience, do you think that time spent on washing dishes by men has increased or decreased over the last 30 years? I'm not sure you would have guessed this, but here are the numbers. But that's not very important. Here is the important part. That's the time spent with children. So for women, it has increased, doubled essentially, but for men, it has tripled, more than tripled. So the first thing you see is that men are spending much more time with kids now than it used to be the case 20, 30 years ago. Wait, there is another dimension to my model. The model predicts that this should be specifically for men with a higher education. Well, the next graph is come from a paper by a sociologist, Altintas. So this is the time, the average number of minutes spent per day, not in any kind of childcare, but in developmental childcare. So, talking to your kids, teaching the kid to read, reading stories to the kid, interacting with him in ways which we know stimulate the development of the kid's brains, which are the first steps of those human capital investments. This is the evolution about between 1980 and 2010. So we see this huge increase, but what's very striking is the increase is all the most important for the blue line, which is the most educated people. So not only the most educated people spend more time than the others with their kids, but the time they spend has increased much more than anybody else. The next prediction is we should see more assortative matching. In the following sense, we should see more frequently educated people marrying educated people. Now, this sounds easy to say. It's very hard to test. It's very hard to test because the numbers have changed a lot. There are many more educated women now than in the past. So it's sure that we're going to see more couples in which both are educated, but that could just be a mechanical effect of the fact that there are more educated women. Stop. So here you really need a kind of fine-tuned structural model to disentangle the mechanical effect of the increase of female education from something else, which would be, in addition to all this, people are more willing to marry a partner with a high level of education when themselves have a high level of education. Now here you have to take my word, we construct this kind of model, and this is not easy, but we do find this. So let me give you some numbers that describe what's going on. Those are, you take all the couples in any given year, and you ask yourself, what's the respective education of the husband and the wife? The red one, they have the same education. Note that it's basically constant. It very slightly increases. The black one, the husband is more educated than the wife, and the green one, the wife is more educated than the husband. Interesting, huh? Now, you have more couples in which the wife is more educated than the husband than the opposite. And believe me, this is there to stay. It's not, a short-term phenomenon that we will forget. Like, the 2008 crisis, it has been extremely serious and everything. But when we look at this retrospectively, 50 years from now, we will see a blip on the curve. This will still be there. I am betting that this will still be there in the next 50 years from now. Second thing, this is fascinating. This is a marriage probability. Well, actually, this is the opposite of marriage probability. That's the probability of remaining single. So you take the generation born in 1940, 45, all the way to 70. And you ask yourself, how does the probability that you never marry change with your education? The educations are in colors. And when you look at male, it's pretty easy to understand. The more educated, the less likely you are to remain single. The more educated you are, the more likely you are to marry. The people at the very bottom, they are the people with the highest level of education. You know, the PhD, low degree, medicine degree. The people at the top of the distribution, the people are very likely to remain single. They are the less educated, high school dropout. Note that this number is 0.6. If you are a high school dropout, the probability that you will marry is 40%. Well, the number of marriages has declined a lot, but especially up there. And this is for the white population. For the black population, it will be something like 80, 85%. Partly because there is a 20, 25% probability that you will be incarcerated at the time of the survey. Women, the story is completely different. Look at this blue line, which are the most educated women. In the generation born in 1940, the worst handicap a woman could have on the marriage market was to have a PhD. The probability that you will remain single was essentially twice that of anybody else. And this was known, by the way. Now it's no longer the case. So we have the same explosion. The scale is not the same. It's only 40% instead of 60%. But now, and this stops generation born in 70. We don't know yet for the generation born after because people tend to marry later. So we'll still need some time. But my bet is that now the blue line will become at the bottom. And so yeah, there is this complete reversal, which is being married at the being educated at the top level used to be a terrible handicap on the marriage market. It's no longer the case. Now, but wait, think about the graph I showed you. Why is it that women invested a lot, whereas men did not? That's a possible explanation. Back then, why is it? The surprising thing is not so much that now women are investing pretty much as men, if not more. You know, there is absolutely no reason why they should not invest. I mean, it's human capital, and human capital is valuable for everyone. The puzzle is, why is it that women back then, 20, 40 years ago, were not investing more? And this tells you because it will giving them a lot of reward on the labor market, but they had to pay a price to pay, and the price was paid on the marriage market. Not only now, a student of mine did her PhD dissertation looking not only at the probability of marriage, but also at whom they're going to marry. And what she was showing is that those women, when they married, were not marrying the top men. They were not marrying the top income men or the most educated men. Actually, the most educated men used to like more women slightly less educated than the top ones. And now it's absolutely not the case. Well, you know, again, this is a change that's, sorry guys, it's a change that's here to stay. Now educated men. Let me give you, let me spend 2 minutes on this graph. I'm supposed to stop, but this one is a bit hard to understand, but when you understand it, it's quite telling. Let me start with an anecdote. 2 years ago, a bit less than 2 years ago, my wife and I had the privilege of attending a dinner with some Nobel laureates, including Bob Solow, who was at that time at the MIT. And I had the privilege of being seated next to the wife of Bob Solow. First name was Bobby. She was a wonderful woman. She was in her 80s, late 80s. Actually, unfortunately, she passed away last year. So I started by telling us, you're a complete counterexample of everything we know about women of your generation, because women were very unlikely to have a PhD. If they had a PhD, they were very unlikely to marry. If they were marrying, they were unlikely to have children. And if they had children, they were unlikely to continue to work. And you did just the opposite. You exactly are the profile of modern women. And then we started talking about this. And I started trying to explain those kind of theory. You know, I was about to write some equations on the napkin. Thankfully, my wife was there and prevented me from doing that. But then at some point, she interrupted me and she said, well, let me try to summarize your story the way I understand that. In my time, she says, so, back then, it was okay to be a nurse because you had a very high probability of marrying a surgeon. Now, if you're a nurse, forget about marrying a surgeon because there is too much competition from female doctors. Now, let me convince you, those graphs are exactly about this. Here we're looking at men. These are the level of education of men, the usual 5 levels. The bottom here, high school dropout, the top, more than college. The color is the education of the wife. So in particular, the blue, the more educated are to the right. So this is a proportion of men with a college plus education marrying a college plus educated woman. And so what you see, the first thing you see here is that if you're educated and you ask yourself what the probability of marrying down, marrying someone who's less educated, this probability has decreased a lot. And it's true at all levels. What I just want you to note is that the light blue area is much larger on the right-hand side than on the left-hand side. If you look at women, it's just the opposite. In particular, if you look at those women here, those are my nurses. That's the probability that they marry a surgeon. Back then and now, probability has been divided by 2 or 3. What does it tell you? It tells you that not having a diploma is much more of a handicap now on the marriage market than it used to be the case. Back then, it was okay, you still have a good chance of marrying up. Now, the chance has melted. You want to marry up, and now you want to marry up more than ever because you want to marry an educated person because that's crucial for the evolution of the kids. You better be educated yourself. Okay, let me conclude. And let me talk about the inequality spiral. What I'm telling you is a story in which now more than ever, the most educated people marry their own. They go out and look for educated people to marry. And when that's done, they invest like crazy in the education on their own children. Now, what we know, here there is something which is of fundamental importance and which I think has been considerably understudied, which is what is exactly the technology of human capital formation. We know that the level of human capital, the ability of a kid at the age 18 or 20 or 25, depends on the whole past. And there are many factors that enter. There is some kind of innate ability. There is the education of the father, the education of the mother, the time spent with the father, the time spent by the mother with the kids. And then there is everything else, the tutors, the schooling system, and so on and so forth. As an economist, the crucial question is, those factors, are they substitute or complement? In other words, if you're starting from a very high level of all the factors but one, does this fact increase or decrease the productivity of the last factor? We all know that it's good to invest on your children, but is it more efficient to invest on children who are already at the top, who have a lot of advantages, or to invest on kids at the bottom? In terms of, outcome regarding the child, human capital, wage, future, and it's not only wage, by the way, it's also probability of committing a crime, probability of getting married, and so on and so forth. The kind of work that have been done, we don't know much, but seems to indicate that at least after the age of 10, those factors are complement. Meaning that what we observe, that the most educated parents marry educated parent and invest a lot in kids, it's exactly the efficient thing to do. What the outcome? The outcome is that the inequality across children of the next generation will be much higher than in the previous one. And this is a spiral. And of course, because of this, the next generation, we will have even more inequality in terms of education, meaning that we will have even more tendency for the people at the top to marry people on the top and invest in the children and so on and so forth. How can we fight that? That's a machine that's much more serious than the financial wealth. Financial wealth, you can put to taxation. We can discuss the gains and benefits of taxation. But this is completely different. And this is not an inequality of income. This is an inequality of opportunities. What I'm telling you is that the kids who are unlucky enough to be born in the wrong type of household with parents who don't have the right level of education and so on and so forth, they don't start in life with the same level of changes, and then this is going to get worse and worse over time. The only solution, I say, and here I'm referring to the work by a close friend of mine, Jim Heckman, who got the Nobel in 2000, is the importance of early intervention. You might do something if you invest a lot, but it's still investing at the level of university, investing even at the level of high school, that's way too late. You want to invest, in particular, you want to invest of the kids at the bottom, you need to do that very early. Now that's true, I think that's true in general, but in the US, if those of you who are familiar with the US who know the terrible quality of the schooling system, and in particular the preschooling system at the bottom of the income distribution, realize that this is a message. What Heckman says is that the social return on investment on very early childhood is huge. For each dollar that you're spending, the social return is $7, $8, $10. So that's exactly, if this would lead to one policy conclusion, it will be the huge importance of very early intervention in life. Thank you very much.